Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall here. We're in the book of Exodus, chapter 2, very important birth today. Started off my sermon with a story about being spiritually shamed. I wonder if you've ever been shamed spiritually by someone who was, at least you thought in your mind, less mature than you were spiritually. Another story, I remember I was a teenager and I had a friend that was involved in some promiscuous activities, and I was taking it upon myself to correct him, to rebuke him. And he said to me, as long as you got that radar detector on your dashboard, I don't think you should be talking to me about what goes on in my back seat. I needed that rebuke. He was showing me that I wasn't as spiritual as I thought I was. How about you? Anybody have any times that someone that you thought was less spiritual than you taught you a lesson? Maybe you got a little shame with that. Well, Exodus chapter 2. Our story starts with three women, a mother, a sister, and an adoptive mother. What is the most amazing thing about this fact? Just first of all, highlight what is the most amazing thing about these three women and how they are in this story. Talk for a second about Moses' mother and her actions, and then talk for a second or two about Moses' sister and her actions, and then finally talk for a second or two about Pharaoh's daughter and her actions. What do you think that each one of their motivations were? Were their motivations different? Were they the same? Talk about these three women and what they did and why. Well, next, Moses gets a name. What does the name of Moses mean? And why is that so beautifully ironic? Of course, Pharaoh's daughter has no idea what the future brings, but this is a beautifully ironic name. Now, does verse 11 give us any indication of Moses' allegiance, whom Moses identifies with? That's popular language in our culture today. I identify as a... Do you think that Moses identifies, based on what you read in verse 11, as an Egyptian or as an Israelite? And how important is who he identifies with what goes on in the next part of the story? Well, the next part of the story, of course, is that Moses is transformed. He's transformed from a compassionate but impetuous leader into one who the Bible will call the meekest man on earth. How do you think that Moses was transformed? What brought about this transformation? And then in Midian, it says in verse 15 that Moses fled to Midian, and it says in verse 16 that he met a priest of Midian. Who are the Midianites? I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 25 and read verses 1 through 4, looking for this phrase Midianites. Who are the Midianites? Where did they come from? Who are their ancestors? Who is their founding father? And based on that, what might their religious beliefs be? What religious beliefs will they have in common with the Israelites because of their roots? And then finally, this story ends in the last two verses with some statements about God. That his heart, what says something about his heart, says something about what he remembered, it says something about what he looked at, and it says something about what he was concerned about. What do these last two verses mean to you about God's relationship with us, about his behavior towards us? Do you find these last two verses encouraging? Do they frustrate you in your relationship with God? I want you just to talk about these last two verses. And then, of course, every week we talk about our application. And our application this week was that God celebrates weakness. God uses the weak to shame the wise. He uses the weak to shame the strong. What does this require of you? What does this idea of leaning into weakness require for you right now at home? What does this idea of leaning into weakness require for you right now at work? And what does this idea of leaning into weakness require of you out in the world? How are you going to become weaker? That's really the question, so that God can become greater, so that he can come stronger. Well, I hope that you have a wonderful group, and I look forward to seeing you next week as we get to Exodus chapter 3 and 4, one of the most amazing and most important passages in all of the Bible. We're going to pick it up next week. I hope you'll be there. God bless. Bye-bye.